se hizo todo el trabajo de volver a su plano, ¿no? De quitar todas esas arrugas. Y después se cosió en ese bastidor. Entonces ahora ya está perfectamente fijo, ya no se mueve, pero por ejemplo, las lagunas o los faltantes de material constitutivo, o sea, de amate, no se rellenaron. O sea, no se hizo absolutamente nada sobre sobre la obra. No se consolidó, no se reintegró, nada. Solamente se devolvió su plano porque eso le estaba afectando, se limpió el polvo, tan, y se montó de tal manera que ya no tenga movimientos y ya no se siga rompiendo. Eso es lo que se hizo a nivel de conservación.
Me acuerdo bien, pero creo que estaba como sobrepuesto el amate sobre lienzo europeo o algo así, pegado.
No,
Cosido.
originalmente el códice o el mapa en sí es papel amate. Eso es todo. Okay. Lo que pasa es que lo tenían cosido en una sábana, de hecho.
Sí. ¿Y eso se lo quitó?
Claro.
Para reconstruir.
Claro, okay. Claro. Para devolverle el plano y después para montarlo de manera adecuada en ese lino con hilo de seda, muy delgadito, pero muy delgaditito.
Ok. ¿Esta sábana más o menos de qué siglo es?
Era de ayer, o sea, contemporánea. Okay. Sí, sí, sí.
Bueno, creo que es toda la duda y muchas gracias.
Sí. En realidad no mucho, como pudo haber sido como un mes, no mucho. Lo que nos tardamos más, en la digital, esa sí nos tardamos como 6 meses. La restauración digital como 6 meses, pero el trabajo sobre el códice muy poquito, porque realmente se le hizo lo básico.
Pues felicitarla por su trabajo, sí, porque es ahora sí una tarea muy ardua, la restauración de un códice. Pues realmente viendo su trabajo, ¿qué recomendaciones nos haría en relación cuando lleguemos a encontrar algún códice, algún mapa o algunas imágenes? Claro, sí, porque suele suceder, ¿no? Llega alguna población y dice, mire, tengo este mapa o alguna imagen, ¿no? Porque hay diferentes materiales, ¿no? Está el amate, está la tela, está
hay sobre piel también.
Está sobre piel, a cuero. Entonces, ¿qué recomendaciones nos haría
pues la primera,
para poder eso?
Hablarle a un especialista, la verdad, porque si le queremos empezar a hacer cosas, no sabemos cómo y podemos perder la pintura, podemos perder datos, ¿no? Por ejemplo, este códice en particular, cuando yo lo trabajé, cuando hicimos los estudios, vimos que ya estaba consolidado y le metieron un polímero, una cuestión ajena. Entonces, ahora ya es difícil identificar, por ejemplo, si tiene algún aglutinante natural o no. Entonces, la verdad es muy importante que se vaya con un especialista, incluso con el INA, ¿no? Pero tiene que ser un profesional quien lo pueda ver, no manipularlo demasiado, no exponerlo a la humedad, no exponerlo a los rayos solares, porque altera. Y tendríamos que ver también cómo está la base, la capa pictórica, si está pulverulenta, si está firme, para manipularlo pues lo menos posible o de una manera plana, pero de verdad lo que hay que hacer es que recurrir a los especialistas, porque si no sí se hacen algunas barbaridades.
¿Qué formato tiene el mapa?
¿Perdón?
¿Qué formato tiene?
El que vieron inicialmente es rectangular, mide como 2 metros, aproximadamente 2 por 1 más o menos. A ver, si quieres vete a la primera. Ahorita se los muestro. Sí, para que lo vean. Así es, ese es su formato. No sé si tienen alguna otra.
Yo tengo una duda. ¿Cuál fue su técnica para digitalización?
Con Photoshop. O sea, tomamos las fotos, pero fotos como con muchísima resolución. Y como les enseñé por ahí, había una foto esa de con luces muy reforzadas. Y entonces ya pues en la computadora se fue completando con Photoshop.
¿Dónde se encuentra el mapa, el original, actualmente?
Pues es de la familia, entonces no te podría decir sí.
Gracias. A lo mejor no corresponde, pero se conoce la historia previa antes de, bueno, a la posesión que tiene ahora la familia. ¿Quién hizo la intervención previa?
No sé quién hizo esa intervención previa y pues estuvo en manos de particulares antes, pues estuvo dando como muchas vueltas, pero en cuanto a la intervención en particular, no hay datos, no hay información.
Sobre la elaboración del mapa, no sé si a partir de su trabajo puede detectar como las etapas de desarrollo de la pintura. Por ejemplo, primero se unieron todas las piezas de amate, ya después hizo el diseño sobre él, no sé.
No, sí, claro. Primero se hizo la hoja, primero se hicieron las hojas y se fueron juntando las hojas hasta tener el formato. Después se le puso como una capa de preparación, como aparentemente como de cal, para que esté bruñidito, para que no se absorbieran los pigmentos. Y después y después se hizo el delineado, como no había lápiz, no había pero ese delineado que les mostré. Después se hicieron las líneas ya gruesas de alrededor y después se rellenó el color. Y a veces en algunos tonos se puso una base de preparación blanca. Todo eso está en el libro, eso sí está explicado ahí. Es que sí, en un ratito no se puede explicar todo. Acabamos. Bueno, gracias.
Okay. Nuestra siguiente conferencia, Primeros, planos y trasfondos del Mapa de Cuauhtinchan número 2, y está a cargo de Jace Weaver y Laura Weaver. Jace Weaver es profesor y director de estudios americanos nativos en la Universidad de Georgia. Se especializa en las tradiciones religiosas nativas. Es autor y o editor de 9 libros sobre varios temas indígenas, incluyendo otras palabras, literatura indioamericana, leyes y cultura. Laura Adams Weaver enseña estudios americanos nativos e inglés en la Universidad de Georgia. Se especializa en las literaturas americanas indígenas y multiculturales. Ha escrito varios artículos sobre la literatura y la cultura americana nativa, incluyendo uno de ellos en la Enciclopedia de Mujeres y Religión en América del Norte. Les damos la bienvenida y comenzamos. Esta conferencia es en inglés y gustan ponerse sus audífonos para la traducción simultánea.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you, and I'd like to also just briefly give our thanks first to David Carrasco for bringing us into this project in the first place, and for Silvia Rodriguez for hosting us and for taking care of all the arrangements, and Romero Martinez and the staff of the Museo Amparo, who has made us feel very welcome. And also, ultimately, our thanks go to the family of Angeles Espinosa Iglesias for the opportunity to work on such an amazing project. I'd also briefly like to offer our apologies for not speaking Spanish well enough to be able to do this in Spanish, and also for our not so sophisticated PowerPoint as all of the other previous people. So.
And thanks to Scott Sessions for helping us out with the slides. Migration and pilgrimage are two of the most powerful forces both in human history and human psychology. Anthropologist Victor Turner describes what he calls man the pilgrim, writing, "The hunt, the voyage, the search, the quest are genres of cultural action as well as literary themes. They must be distinguished from nomadism under economic pressure, travel for the sake of curiosity, and the migration for the sake of employment. The quest, particularly the pilgrim quest, always implies a return from a far to a familiar place. It also implies a dichotomy between sacred and profane, symbolized between the far and near. And the paradox that spatially distant, the far, is veritably the spiritually near. In going away, one seeks to return from exile. In returning home, one is actually leaving home. Obviously, even in the context of North American indigenes, we cannot do these powerful twin themes, migration and pilgrimage, justice within the time of this brief presentation. What we will do is begin by discussing native migrations, both historical and mythological. In our chapter in Caves, City, and Eagle's Nest, we specifically examine 3 pilgrimage traditions, all with ties to Mexico. First, the web of pilgrimage trails that tie together the territory of the Kachan. Secondly, the salt pilgrimage of the Tohono O'odham, and the peyote hunt of the Huichol. These examples are meant to be suggestive rather than exhaustive. They are representative of the power of migration and pilgrimage for human beings in general and indigenous peoples in particular. Today, in the interest of time, we will limit ourselves to one, to the Tohono O'odham salt pilgrimage. We will then apply insights from these case studies to the Mapa de Cuauhtinchan number 2. At the outset, it must be said that it is difficult to generalize about things indigenous. In dealing with the indigenous cultures of North America, one is dealing with hundreds of diverse cultures that sometimes differ one from the other, as the culture of France differs from that of Tibet. And the religious traditions that both stem from them and undergird and permeate them are as different as Christianity is from Hinduism. But despite their differences, each of these indigenous cultures and religious systems are geomythological. That is to say, they're shaped by the geography from which the people originated and in which they found themselves. The environment, the climate, the landscape. They are rooted in the land, and not land in some generalized sense, but in the land they perceive as theirs. This is nowhere more evident than in myths of origin. As Sioux scholar Vine Deloria said, native creation myths, in contrast to the Jewish Christian account of Genesis, are not about what happened then, they're about what happened here. It is on this foundational level of creation myth that we have our first connection to the MC2 and the people who made it.
Every Native people has some form of origin story. Some have more than one, and these are not always easily recognizable. These myths come in many forms. Creation might be sung into being, as it is among the Maidu of California. The creator might think the world into being, as Awanawalona did for the Zuni of Arizona. Rarely do Native traditions concern themselves with stories that explain the creation of the whole universe. Such accounts reflect a creation ex nihilo, a creation out of nothing, when imagining the beginnings of this world. By contrast, in indigenous traditions, all the elements of creation are usually already present, merely awaiting their use by the creative power. Although there is much diversity, though, two types of stories tend to predominate in North America: the earth diver myth and the emergence myth. In earth diver myths, the entire world is covered by water. Some primordial aquatic creature, a muskrat, a beaver, a water beetle, whatever, usually after failed attempts by other animals, dives down beneath the waters and brings up a little bit of mud. This mud is then spread out to form all the Earth's land mass, after which the world is populated by human beings and land animals. In keeping with the geomythological character of these cultures, earth diver myths tend to be found among peoples originating in environments where water is very abundant. After all, consider how the mythopoeic imagination works. Mythopoeic imagination works. What sense does it make to posit a world created entirely out of water when you live in a place where water is a scarce and precious resource to be carefully managed? The other principal type of creation myth, emergence myths, tends to be a dry land story. In these accounts, the people and other living beings exist in a world, sometimes successive worlds, underground. It's an image of creation at birth, the people emerging literally out of the ground, out of the womb of the earth. This is what we witness among the Cuauhtinchan Laka, as we observe represented in MC2, Chikomostak, the 7 caves, the place of origin from which the tribal leaders emerged. After this emergence, the peregrinations, the migration depicted in MC2, begin. Before we move to the consideration of migration, we must rest for a time here at the point of origin, of creation. A moment ago, we asked you to consider how the mythopoeic imagination works. 2 important points must be made here. The first point is that peoples, in one sense, tend to mythologize the practical, the historical. Today, in the United States, the Pueblo peoples of Arizona and New Mexico tell emergence creation myths. In that arid environment, in keeping with the geomythological character of indigenous cultures, this makes perfect sense. Yet there is a deeper level underlying the simple environmental explanation. The ancestors of the Pueblo were the Anasazi, a group known by a name given to them by the recent Athabascan immigrants, the Navajo and Apache. And their name means ancient ones. The Anasazi originally lived underground in pit houses. In the harsh climate of the Southwest, this was eminently practical. Such dwellings provided a year-round temperature-controlled environment, warmer in winter and cooler in the summer. Over the course of time, these people moved to above-ground living. They retained, however, their pit houses as sites of ceremonial activity. These chambers, known as kivas, are still used by Pueblos today. They continue to provide climate control, and they keep the rituals conducted there out of public view. Beyond this, however, the act of going into the round kivas is thought of as a symbolic return to the place of origin, back into the womb of the earth from which the people emerged. A hole in the kiva, called a sipapu, is recognized as the point of emergence. Of course, in a very real sense, it is also going back to a place where the people actually did live in ancient times. It is a literal return home. We mentioned above that tribal nations often have multiple creation stories, just as the Nahua tell of differing accounts of emergence from Chico-Mostok and migration from Aslan. Contemporary Choctaws in Oklahoma and Mississippi tell two distinct versions of their origins. As Tom Mould explains, according to migration story, the Choctaw originally lived in the West and migrated to Mississippi by divine providence. In the emergence story, the Choctaw and often the other native tribes of the Southeast were created and led out of the mound in Mississippi by divine providence. The first focuses on how the Choctaw came to live in Mississippi. The second, how the Choctaw were created as men and women, I should add. Despite the difference in focus, outside scholars and Choctaws alike have noted the contradiction in the two stories, and that's an end to his quote. Most often, the point of emergence is said to be Naniwea, an actual cave located in Mississippi. The earliest Mississippi Choctaw migration account, cataloged by Mould, dates to 1899. It's impossible to prove absolutely, but the original migration story does in some sense reconcile with the archaeological evidence that the original people who became Choctaw once they reached Mississippi had begun earlier in the South and a little to the West. But we also believe that such stories post-date removal as a way to mythologically account for the bilocation of the Choctaws that resulted during the removal. The Cherokee and the Choctaw, along with other southeastern tribal nations, were removed from their territorial homelands to the trans-Mississippi West in 1830s. They went to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, neither as questing pilgrims nor as willing immigrants. Rather, they were subjected to a genocidal reverse exodus by the United States government. As a result of this forced migration, they were deprived of numerous sites of memory, of a numinous landscape populated by places that have absorbed the power of the people who have been there and the events that have happened there. The twin Choctaw creation myths, migration from the West and emergence in the East, thus reunite the beginning and the end of the Trail of Tears. Mould overstates the singularity of the Choctaw, though, when he writes that they have, quote, often been described as unique in that they have two distinct stories of their origin, end quote. The Hopi, like other Pueblo peoples, relate an emergence origin, but they also have a migration story. The differing accounts are believed to reflect the fact that the people were the coalescence of different fragmented groups. In like fashion, the Cherokee preserved divergent creation accounts. In common with other members of the Iroquoian language family, they attribute world beginnings to an earth diver myth. At the same time, the so-called vision of Elo, the grand sacred history traditionally told at the annual New Year's Festival of Green Corn, states, "When we lived beyond the great waters, there were 12 clans belonging to the Cherokee tribe. Today, the Cherokee are 7 clans, 5 having been lost in the migration. While it's easy to attribute this myth superficially to some relationship to the supposed migration of the first people to cross the Bering Strait land bridge to settle on this continent, which is one explanation, more probably it reflects a racial memory of movement away from the other peoples of the Iroquoian language family, where the Cherokee people originally began up in the Northeast, what is today moving into what is today the American Southeast. The Cherokee are the southernmost anchor of the Iroquoians. It is what Jones and Falk accurately label an untraceable antiquity. At the recent opened National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, an exhibit on the Cherokees includes a video loop, which concerns the recovery of the Katua Mound in North Carolina by the Eastern Band of Cherokee. The Katua Mound is sometimes called the Mother Mound of the Cherokee. It was the location of the principal council house of the Cherokee, within which the hearth of the sacred eternal flame burns. It was said that if that fire ever goes out, the Cherokee will cease to be a people. The mound was not built by the Cherokee, since they migrated from the Northeast. They found it already constructed when they migrated into the region. It was lost from Cherokee hands at the time of removal, though the flame was kindled and transported physically along the Trail of Tears to their new home in the Indian Territory. In 1997, the mound was repurchased by the Eastern Band. In this video, James Bird, a member of the Eastern Band, states that some say that the mound is the emergence place of the Cherokee into the world. Taken literally, this is simply incorrect. Although there is a Cherokee migration myth, as we noted previously, the Cherokee are an earth diver people, not an emergence one, though we do not doubt for a minute that some at the Eastern Band Reservation believe the latter. The Cherokee did not migrate into the area until around 1200. They did not build the mound, the Mississippians did. The Cherokee simply found it, recognized this high place as a site of power, and adapted it to their own use. There is absolutely no evidence in the ethnographic record to indicate an emergence from Katua.
This mound was originally about 65 feet high, but in the 1920s, the white farmer who owned the property at that time bulldozed it to make it easier to farm.
So, this story about the emergence, on a more fundamental level, however, this literal reading misunderstands what myth does. And this is the second critical point to be made about origination myths. Myths distill and unite metaphorical and practical dimensions of reality. Origin myths are not about the creating of the entire cosmos or the whole world, even when they appear to be. They are about the creation and identity of a people and how they came to be in their place in the world. The story told by MC2 is, in its essence, quite clear on this. We state that the Cherokee are an earth diver people, that they have a migration myth, that modernly some of the Eastern Band believe in an emergence from the Katua Mound, and that those in the last